As I said, thank you very much for the invitation. And I was asked to speak on management of forest, grasslands, and crops to fight fire, particularly from the point of view of disasters, disaster management, and from my perspective, disaster prevention. And what are the measures to take? So to start off with, who can forget those Knysna fires of 2017? I think we were all watching news for a long period of time with trepidation and seeing what was unfolding with those Knysna fires. There were at least 7 fatalities, at least 15,000 hectares of land burnt, and around 800 or so buildings destroyed. So that raises a few questions. How can we prevent a recurrence of such an event? How can we prevent similar disasters from other places, from occurring in other places? How can we prevent destructive fires? And every year, vegetation fires cause destruction of property and threaten lives and livelihoods. So we can ask the question, why is that? Now, in addition to those Knysna fires, I think we're all aware of various other fires that have caused destruction in South Africa, as well as internationally. We all see news articles and news footage of fires in Australia, fires in California, and various other places where vegetation fires get out of hand and cause a lot of destruction. Now, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, Africa is often known as the fire continent, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The grassy or shrubby biomass forms a great fine fuel that is able to carry fire. We'll look at the details of fine fuel a little later on. And much of Africa comprises savannas and grasslands, and much of that burns. Africa's climate is has usually pronounced annual wet and dry cycles. That's a characteristic of the climate over most of Africa. And there are long cycles of drought and cycles of high rainfall. For example, the El Nino and La Nina, and we're currently in the third year of a La Nina cycle with excessive rainfall or above average rainfall in most of Southern Africa. So there are other factors as well that affect weather cycles, but the El Nino and La Nina are quite well known for that. Then in Africa, lightning and human ignition play a huge role in fires and fire spread. And then the last point around fires in Africa is that fire is a critical ecosystem driver, and it affects the structure of vegetation, the composition of vegetation, and also the function of that vegetation. In South Africa, getting a little bit closer to home, there's a gradient of fire frequency and fire occurrence. It's relatively rare in the western parts of the country, the western dry parts of the country, like the semi-desert and arid Karoo, and it's very frequent in the mesic grasslands, example in the Drakensberg and the Mpumalanga Highveld and other mesic areas. And what is quite important to note is that natural fire regimes that would have occurred before humans had a large influence on fire regimes, these natural fire regimes are no longer a reality, and anthropogenic influences actually drive fire and fire occurrences largely. So the image in front of us shows an example of fires that burn in the world, and this data is from the University of Maryland from MODIS active fire detections, and this is 2007 data. And although this is at a relatively coarse scale, it picks up fires within particular pixels and colors them red, we can see that for the most part, Africa burns. Sub-Saharan Africa is literally called that fire continent. There are other parts of the world as well, but we will focus on the Sub-Saharan Africa. Getting closer to home and looking at South Africa, we start on the bottom left and have a look at the rainfall map of South Africa. High rainfall in the dark blue and low rainfall in the lighter, almost white colors. We can see the high rainfall belts with some high rainfall in the fynbos vegetation down in the Western Cape, Southern Cape, and then going up through KwaZulu-Natal, eastern parts of Mpumalanga, Gauteng, and all of the parts that are colored in the darker blue colors experience relatively high rainfall. If we look at the map on your right, the biomes of South Africa, we can see corresponding to the rainfall, we can see the fynbos biome in purple at the bottom in the Western and Southern Cape, the grassland and savanna biomes in the green and brown color corresponding to the higher rainfall. And then, excuse me, the biomes towards the west of the country, the Karoo, succulent Karoo, and the more arid parts of the savanna have lower rainfall. Then if we look at the map on the top left, it shows fire distribution in South Africa between 2007 and 2013. And that's a map drawn up by Stradum and Savage. And we can see that that map, or the fire occurrence during that period of time, almost mirrors the rainfall and has a very close association with the vegetation biomes. So we can see that actually we know where fires are going to occur. We know where they have occurred. We know the vegetation types where they will occur, and we know the rainfall or climate conditions under which fires will occur. So that's something that we know for sure. We know where we can expect fires. If we have a look at when we can expect fires, I've drawn a map of from the same data from Stradum and Savage. And the months of the year on the bottom axis correspond to January through to December, months 1 to 12. We can see that the majority of fires occur from about June to October, maybe November. And those are fires that occur in the summer rainfall areas, and they occur during the winter or the early part of the rainy season. And in the Western Cape, fires occur during winter, those months June, July, August, and in fact, May, June, July, August, pretty much. December, I got that wrong. Sorry, December, January, February, and into March, the fires occur in the Western Cape. So now, apart from knowing where fires occur, we can also predict when fires are most likely to occur based on common weather patterns. So what do we do about it? Well, South Africa does have various bits of legislation, including the National Veld and Forest Fire Act. And the purpose of that act is really to prevent and combat veld, forest, and mountain fires. This act legislates fire protection associations. It legislates a fire danger rating system, which is active. It legislates veld fire prevention through the use of fire breaks and other means. And it also has some legislation around firefighting. There's also some related legislation to this Veld and Forest Fire Act, including the National Environmental Management Act, Conservation of Agricultural Resources Act, Biodiversity Act, and Protected Areas Act. So let's move on and talk about fire itself. And I've labeled this the good, the bad, and the ugly. And on the good side, fire is a natural phenomenon that has and continues to shape ecosystems. It's involved in and drives nutrient cycling. It creates habitats for many species. It's an integral part of savanna, grassland, and fynbos ecosystems. And fire, in fact, reduces the risk of wildfires. So in other words, fire prevents fire. On the destruction side, or the bad side, fire is actually the most important natural disaster in South Africa. It affects lives, it affects livelihoods, it affects infrastructure, and it has some other side effects such as pollution and probably a few others as well, but these are the main ones. Then on the ugly side, the media normally depicts only the destructive nature of fire, and photos and terminology used in the media generally show only the ugly side, only the destruction, and only the bad side. So the media very often overstates negative impacts of fire. Example, you'll read in a newspaper headline, 500 hectares destroyed. Now, actually that vegetation is not destroyed. It's going to regrow as soon as the rain comes. So some biomass may have been burnt by the fire, but the vegetation is not destroyed. And the vegetation in South Africa is very resilient to fire and bounces back very quickly. The media also focuses only really on reactive fire management and fire suppression. The media ignores largely proactive fire management and ignores coverage of issues like fire breaks, prescribed fires, the role of prescribed fires, and things like the removal of alien vegetation, which plays a critically important role in being proactive about preventing fires. Fire ecology is largely ignored in the media, and fire is usually only reported in the media when it's destructive. Therefore, all fires are bad. And that's the perception that the general public in South Africa has, is that all fires are bad. So if we look at a little bit more detail on grassland and savanna fire ecology, the extent and the structure of grasslands and savannas are determined by climate, herbivory, and fire. Those are the three main variables that affect the vegetation structure and extent. In arid areas, grasses are generally quite palatable, and in South Africa we refer to those as sweet grasses or sweetveld. The productivity is generally relatively low, and the fuel load is generally relatively low. And that corresponds to those western areas on the map that we showed a little bit earlier of fire occurrence in South Africa. In those areas, fire is generally quite erratic and is dependent very much on fuel load and mean annual precipitation. And in those areas also, the woody cover is dependent largely on mean annual precipitation. Because of fires being relatively infrequent, fires don't play a huge role on the structure of that vegetation. But in the mesic areas, mature grass at the end of the rainy season is generally quite unpalatable. The above ground net primary productivity or biomass is high, therefore fuel loads are high. Fires are quite frequent and they are dependent more on ignition events than anything else. In other words, if someone lights a fire, it's going to burn. And woody cover in these more mesic areas is determined largely by fire. So fire plays a big role in the structure and composition of vegetation in the mesic areas, and a bit less so in the more arid areas. Frequent fire is actually also correlated to quite high vegetation diversity. And the photo on the right-hand side shows an annually burned grassland with just some ideas of, or some indicators of vegetation diversity in that particular plot. Unaffected by fire. In fact, frequent fire in mesic grassland areas is related to higher diversity than infrequent fire. So fire is not all bad. If you have a look at the three images in front of you now, and look at the top left image, that's a photo of a grass tuft growing in a pot. And just to illustrate the structure of a tufted grass, and our grasslands and savannas in South Africa are made up of a number of tufted grass species. In fact, South Africa's got a very high diversity of grass species. But these tufts are made up of individual tillers, and tillers are formed from other tillers, and perennial grasses keep forming tillers and keep living for a very long time. The growth points are at the base of that plant, so a fire doesn't affect the growth points of the plant. Once a fire burns and removes the top cover of that grass tuft, it will regrow quite readily as soon as there's enough moisture. These grass tufts reproduce by tillering, and if we look at the tuft on the right-hand side top photo, you can see a new tiller emerging from the base of that plant through the dead litter around the base of that plant. Frequent defoliation, whether it's by grazing or mowing or fire, encourages the plants to actually tiller laterally and to spread out across the landscape. A lack of fire, as in the photo in the bottom photo, results in a buildup of dead material, a lack of light penetrating to the base of the plant. The plants aren't able to tiller effectively, and generally tufts become quite sparse, and the basal area of those tufts becomes quite small. And then when a fire does occur, there's a huge amount of fuel, as you can see in that photo, which is going to cause a relatively hot fire, and that is a fire that can potentially be quite destructive when there is a lot of fuel. So grass ecology and the ecology of an individual grass plant is really interesting. If you switch to fynbos, I'm not going to say much about fynbos, except to say that it is a very fire-prone shrubland and also a fire-dependent shrubland. The fynbos in South Africa, everybody knows, is a biodiversity hotspot, and fire is integral to the health of fynbos. Fynbos, like grasslands, is a source of fine fuel, so it's able to carry a fire very effectively during the dry months, which in the Western Cape fynbos areas is the summer months. And biomass in the fynbos can vary from 10 to 40 tons a hectare, which is very high. Grasslands would be in the vicinity of 5, maybe to 8 tons a hectare in the really wet areas, and less than 5 in the more arid areas. So fynbos carries a large biomass. And fynbos has a particular fire cycle, and it varies a little bit from place to place and depending on the climate and other conditions. But once the fire interval in fynbos gets quite long, you know that a fire is going to happen. And when it does happen, it's going to be quite a severe fire because that fuel load continues to build up. If we look at forest patches and thickets, these, particularly within the grassland biome in KwaZulu-Natal and the eastern Highveld areas of Mpumalanga, forests often occur as islands of relatively non-flammable patches, and those are quite resistant to fire. And the reason why they are resistant to fire is that the forest margin interface between forest and the surrounding grasslands acts as a buffer and is generally also relatively fire resistant. And depending on conditions, and depending on fire conditions around that forest, the forest margins can expand and contract. But if fires are controlled and are relatively cool around forests, forests are not affected by fires at all. But under certain conditions, obviously they can be. Let's have a look at some of the modified ecosystems that we have and agriculture and forestry. If we have a look at plantation forestry, the plantation forestry industry is based on relatively long production cycles, usually lasting decades. And that's very different to agricultural crop cycles, which last 1 year, and some of the horticultural crop cycles, which last a few years. And the forestry industry is very significantly impacted by fires. And as an example, in January to August in 2007, around 61,000 hectares or so burnt in Mpumalanga and KZN. The impacts of that, direct impacts, about 1.3 billion rands worth of direct impacts, but there are also longer term impacts of interrupted production cycles, and future wood supply is impacted, and also the flow of that wood supply is impacted. Now, most plantations occur within grasslands in South Africa, and therefore the surrounding areas are subjected to grassland fire ecology and grasslands burn, as we have discussed. I've put a photo of a pine plantation on the right-hand side with a lot of Chromalina invasion around the margins of that forest. Now, Chromalina is an alien plant, and we'll discuss alien plants in a moment. But Chromalina is one particular plant that burns very vigorously because of some chemicals inside it. And this particular photo shows an accident waiting to happen. So it's very easy to predict that that plantation is going to burn sometime, and when it burns, it will burn quite vigorously. If we look at crops, most of the crops grown in South Africa don't really produce fuel conducive to uncontrollable fires, although there are some exceptions, and maize is an example of such an exception. So maize can potentially burn in the early part of the winter prior to harvesting, in which case the crop may be lost. But what happens more frequently is that the dry maize stover, which can be about 3 to 5 tons of material left over after harvest, can be quite a significant fire hazard. That is often mitigated by grazing maize stover, which reduces the fuel load. What's interesting and contrasting to the plantation forestry is that fire in maize stover doesn't materially affect the next season's crop. The direct economic impact on the crop yield will be quite low if maize stover burns. The primary impact might be to carry fire to other vulnerable areas and also reduction of potential forage for livestock. So there are some impacts, but not that huge. Other crops very rarely burn before harvest because they're still green, so the risk is relatively low. Irrigated crops are very unlikely to burn, and horticultural crops are generally quite low risk as well because of a lack of fine fuels to carry the fire between trees or between cropping areas. So that hopefully sums up some of the dynamics around fires and the impact of fires on crops and croplands, very different to that of plantations. Now, if we have a look at fires and fires themselves, not all fires are equal, and fire intensity can be measured very easily, and the intensity of a fire depends very much on the quantity of fuel, biomass, fuel load, as I referred to earlier, above ground net primary productivity. And the fuel quality is also important. So how flammable is that fuel? And where you have a fine fuel with a large surface area to volume ratio, such as grass and faneable shrubs, are good examples of good fine fuel for a fire. Moisture content affects the flammability and the ability to burn, and frosty, dry winters create really dry fuel loads conducive to high fires. And then many plants have various chemical compounds, such as terpenes, waxes, oils, or fats that make them burn even hotter. And camelina from that previous photo of the pine plantation is one example of that. It has chemicals which make it burn exceptionally hot and exceptionally fast. Then weather obviously plays a big role. The higher the wind, the faster the fire spreads, and the more intense the fire. The hotter the temperature, the drier the fuel, and the more intense the fire. Same with relative humidity, and same with the days since last rainfall. So in other words, the days since last rainfall plays a big role in influencing how wet the fuel is. And in the two photos on the right, we have photos of an experimental fire, two experimental fires on our Ukalinga research farm outside Pietermaritzburg. The first one on the top is a fire with 3 years worth of biomass that is built up. So it's on a fire cycle of 3 years. And you can see it's quite an intense fire, and you can see relative to the person standing in the foreground, how high those flames are with 3 years worth of fire. The photo on the bottom is a fire that is burnt annually. It's a treatment that's burnt annually, and it is also mowed towards the end of the growing season to remove biomass. And you can see the complete difference in fire intensity between those two. Those were burnt on the same day under the same conditions, and the only difference really was fuel load. So fuel load plays a huge role in fires and fire intensity, and obviously on the impacts of the fire and the controllability of that fire. If we look at fire regimes can be quantified by fire frequency. In other words, how frequent do fires burn naturally, and how frequent should they burn? Fire intensity is another measure of fire frequency, and the intensity can be measured, and the intensity is measured as kilojoules per second per meter. And intensity is a product of the heat yield of the fuel multiplied by the fuel consumed, multiplied by the rate of spread. All of those are relatively easy to measure, so it's quite easy to quantify fire intensity and to quantify the potential fire intensity of areas that might burn. The extent of fires is in vegetation, natural vegetation, is largely a function of linear infrastructure. In other words, roads can play a big role. And in the photo on the right, the fuel load is relatively low. A fire burnt on the right-hand side of that little Jeep track, and that was enough to stop the fire spreading from the right to the left. So infrastructure can play a role in stopping fires. If there was a high fuel load or a strong wind, that road wouldn't have played a role in stopping that fire. Mosaic landscapes, fire breaks, fire suppression can all influence the extent of fires. And the extent of fires in the current age is much less than the extent of fires before man played a big role in influencing landscapes. Then something else influencing fires is obviously ignition. And in historical times, lightning would have played a big role in Africa in particular. And lightning is related to rainfall, higher rainfall, greater storm frequency, greater biomass, greater above ground net primary productivity, and thus more fires. But in the current age, where landscapes are really anthropogenically influenced, humans are now the major cause of fires. Lightning still plays a role, but most fires are either accidental or arson or management prescribed fires. And fires that cause damage are usually one of those three: prescribed fires that get away, or arson, or some other form of accidental fire ignition. Alien vegetation I've mentioned a few times, and that plays a critical role in fire. Alien vegetation replaces indigenous vegetation. It's often more flammable. It changes the structure of the vegetation. So grassland changes to shrubby tree type vegetation. Savannas, tree shrub density changes in savannas with alien plant invasion. Fynbos can change to trees, and forest margins can be transformed, particularly with more flammable plants growing in the forest margins, so that you don't have that margin from grassland straight to the forest margin. You have something in between, and flammability is often an important factor there. So the photos on the right-hand side, the top photo shows a grassland that has been invaded by wattle trees. Wattles are very flammable, even when they're green, as in this case. And that fire is far hotter and spreading far faster than it would have been in the adjacent uninvaded grassland. And you can see in the bottom photo that the fire actually gets up into the wattle trees, and that changes the characteristics and dynamics of that fire completely. If we flash back to the Knysna forests, one of the main findings on the investigation into the Knysna forest, into the Knysna fires, was a lack of alien plant control, and alien plants contributed a great significance to the spread of that fire and difficulty in controlling it. Now, climate change, and the previous speakers have mentioned a few things about climate change. I just want to focus on one particular aspect, and that is temperatures. We know that temperatures are increasing. We can see the patterns, and we know they're going to continue to increase. So increasing temperatures are going to facilitate more frequent and intense fires. We know that. The fuel load will be drier. The fire season will be longer. In other words, the dry season will be longer. And suitable conditions for hot or very intense fires will increase. We know that. El Nino and La Nina events have had a significant effect on fire frequency, and we're currently in the third year of a La Nina event, which is relatively unprecedented. And what we do know is that our biomass in the grasslands and savanna areas is building up. So when we have a dry spell, if the La Nina is succeeded by an El Nino event, which is dry, we know we're going to have a lot of fuel that's going to be dry and it's going to burn. So we know that's going to happen. Then other aspects around climate change or changing weather patterns. For example, changing rainfall patterns, in particular, not so much the amount of rainfall, but the time of year that rain falls in the eastern parts of the Karoo has led to grasslands actually moving westwards into the eastern Karoo around the Middelburg area. And that leads to increased fire activity, greater fine fuel, and the ability for fires to carry has increased. So we know that some parts of the country are going to experience increased fire activity. An important aspect to consider is there's a very strong interaction between fire and grazing. And grazing by livestock, largely cattle, reduces the fuel load and influences fire frequency and intensity. So the more cattle we have, the less fires we'll have. Fire influences forage quality, and that can have a significant impact on mesic grasslands in particular. So if we have regular fires in mesic grasslands, grass quality will be improved, more grass will be grazed, less fuel. Fire can also reduce the biomass available for grazing, and that can have a significant impact in arid areas. So if you have fire in arid areas, which is less desirable, there's less forage for grazing animals. And so the overriding message from this slide is that fire and herbivores compete for grass, fuel, or forage, and particularly in the wetter parts of the country. If there is grass fuel, it's going to either burn or get grazed. So grazing plays an important role in managing for fire disaster management, and can play an increasingly important role if grazing is managed carefully. Just an example, and this comes from the Ponderland coastal grasslands, which is a biodiversity hotspot, so an area that under current management still maintains an exceptionally high biodiversity. And the local cattle owners burn patches of grassland on a seemingly erratic pattern, but I think they have got a really good idea of what they're doing. So in the photo on the left, we can see a cow eating some really short, relatively recently burnt grass, and behind it is an unburnt area in the more beige color. In the photo on the top right, we can see 3 different times since fire. In the foreground, probably several months since the last fire. In the area, the blackened area where cattle are standing, it's probably a week to 2 weeks, just starting to green up, and the cattle are already eating the the green grass. And in the background, areas have been unburnt for at least 1 to 2 years. And on the bottom right is again a picture of that mosaic with unburnt areas in the foreground, a burnt strip in the middle, unburnt areas, another burnt strip. Now, that kind of pattern in the landscape is actually a really high level of protection against wildfire, because if a fire gets into the unburnt area and burns, it's very soon going to run into an area with very low fuel load, and it'll be very easy for that fire to be stopped or to stop by itself. So in other words, this patch mosaic burning example on those ponderland grasslands is a relatively easy and almost natural way of combating the spread of fire and the risk of fire. So using fire to fight fire. Now, fire breaks. Let's discuss fire breaks for a moment. The legislation, that Veldt Forest Fire Act, legislates that people, landowners, need to burn fire breaks. And landowners include municipalities, which is often forgotten. And fire breaks are a strategically located strip or an area with no or reduced fuel load to prevent the spread of fire. So the reason that fire breaks are important is they're there to either stop or slow a fire down. And probably most importantly, they're there to provide the opportunity to start a backfire in the path of any oncoming fire to suppress any oncoming fire. So in other words, fight fire with fire. So fire breaks serve two really important roles: either stop or slow a fire, but maybe even more importantly, to provide opportunity to fight a fire. Fire breaks are commonly burned quite early in the dry season, and they commonly burned in combination with roads or other linear infrastructure to help break areas and to help with fire and fire management. And those are legislated, they should be burnt, and municipalities in particular need to take responsibility for protecting their municipal areas. If we have a look at the ecological impacts of fire breaks, now fire breaks are frequently burnt on the same spot every year, and there are often question marks raised about, isn't that destructive? Isn't that going to cause problems? Well, several studies have shown that you get slight composition changes in fire breaks that are burnt every year compared to the adjacent areas that are not burnt every year. But those aren't really regarded as degradation. There's really negligible diversity differences. Soil surface, there are marginal differences in terms of soil acidity, organic matter, and lower nitrogen levels, but just on the soil, not deep into the soil. And in terms of biomass recovery, generally before the end of that first season after a fire, the biomass is equal to areas that were not burnt. So no real impacts. Forest quality, is more or less equivalent. So we can regard fire breaks, annual fire breaks, as being a sustainable practice, certainly in the short to medium term. Those are reinforced by the Mpumalanga grassland fire experiments, where studies have shown that more than 60 years of annual burning have resulted in greater richness and diversity on the annually burnt plots than on less frequently burnt plots. So frequent burning in mesic grasslands is not a problem. So fire breaks can have a major role to play. So if we look at integrated management, we need to look at fighting fire with fire, using fire to reduce fire. We need to look at alien plant control. We need to protect forest margins, and we need
Prof
to
Kirkman?
have, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you wrap up, please?
Yes, I'm on the last slide coming now.
Oh, great.
And we need to be proactive rather than reactive. So in conclusion, we know where fires are going to burn in South Africa. We know when they're going to burn. We know what conditions exacerbate the risk, for example, bird winds. We know what to do about it. We can monitor vegetation, biomass, and greenness. We can monitor time since last fire. We can manage the fuel loads, and we have the expertise, and we should not be surprised by extreme fire events. I think we have all of the expertise and everything we need to prevent fire disasters. We just need to do it. Thank you.